The afternoon sun was warm, but not uncomfortably so, as the general drove down the quiet suburban street. He had just finished attending a military ceremony, where he was honored for his years of service, a recognition he had earned through dedication, discipline, and countless hours of hard work. His uniform was neat and polished, the medals on his chest catching the light in a way that silently spoke of his accomplishments. Despite the weight of the uniform and the medals, he felt a lightness inside him that came with the pride of serving his country. The road was mostly empty, with only a few cars passing by, and the hum of tires on pavement was the only sound that accompanied him. He drove carefully, respecting the speed limit, aware of the responsibility that came with both his rank and his age. Life had taught him patience, and today it was more necessary than ever. Out of nowhere, a police car appeared behind him with its lights flashing. He glanced in the mirror and immediately pulled over. Traffic stops were routine, and as a high-ranking officer in the military, he had encountered his share of them. He reached for his registration and license, keeping his hands clearly on the steering wheel. Everything seemed normal at first. He expected the usual questions, maybe a warning, maybe a ticket, but nothing about this stop felt ordinary from the start. The officer approaching his car had a stern expression, but there was something else too. An edge, a suspicion that seemed out of proportion. The general rolled down his window slowly and offered a polite greeting. The officer responded curtly, asking for his license and registration. As the general handed over his documents, he noticed the officer's eyes lingered on him a little too long, a strange tension in the way he moved. The officer barked a question about why he was driving so slowly, and the general explained that he was simply following the speed limit. There was no hesitation in his voice, only calm and clarity. The officer's hand twitched almost subconsciously, as if he were ready to escalate at the slightest provocation. The general, noticing this, stayed calm. He had been trained for tense situations, and he understood instinctively that any sudden movement or raised voice could make things worse. Then, without warning, the officer drew his gun. The movement was sharp, aggressive, and completely unprovoked. The general froze, keeping his hands clearly in view, the medals on his chest now gleaming in the sunlight. His heart did not race. He had faced danger in far more dangerous places than this suburban street. But he was also acutely aware of how precarious the situation was. Every passerby, every onlooker, would see only what was happening at that moment, not the years of experience and calm that he carried with him. The officer demanded that he step out of the car. The general kept his voice steady, explaining his rank, his service, and that he was not a threat. He spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every word carried authority without aggression. He knew that any sudden movement could trigger disaster. His experience in the military had taught him patience and the importance of control in moments of high tension. The officer did not listen. He kept the gun raised, eyes scanning the interior of the car. Suspicion etched across his face. The general's calmness seemed only to frustrate him more. From the corner of his eye, the general saw a couple of drivers slow down and glance at the unfolding scene, phones raised to record the incident. He did not move. He knew that he had to maintain composure, not just for himself, but to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. Minutes felt like hours. The general kept his posture straight, hands visible, speaking clearly and firmly. He mentioned his attendance at the military ceremony earlier, the medals on his chest, and the fact that he had dedicated decades to serving the country. His words were factual, devoid of anger, but they carried the weight of experience and respect. The officer's hand wavered slightly, but he did not lower the gun. The tension was palpable, and the general could feel the weight of the officer's prejudice in every movement and glance. Despite the danger, the general's mind remained focused. He considered every possible outcome, every action he could take to keep the situation from becoming tragic. He understood the power imbalance. He also understood that any escalation could end badly, not just for the officer, but for him as well. Years of training, both physical and mental, allowed him to remain calm in the eye of what felt like a storm. He spoke again, his tone steady, explaining that he was willing to cooperate fully, but that threats were unnecessary. The officer's eyes flicked to the medals on the general's chest again, but he still did not recognize their significance. The general's presence alone, his calm demeanor and visible authority, were not enough to pierce the wall of prejudice in the officer's mind. The world outside the car seemed distant, the sounds muted except for the officer's uneven breathing and the distant hum of traffic. Passers-by were now cautiously observing, some whispering to one another, sensing that what they were witnessing was far from ordinary. Inside the car, the general reflected on the countless times he had faced danger and prejudice, moments when people judged him before they understood who he was. He had learned the importance of patience and restraint. Today he would rely on those lessons fully. He reminded himself that he could not allow fear or anger to dictate his actions. He was trained to act, but he was also trained to think, to assess, and to control the outcome without unnecessary confrontation. He spoke again, calmly, to the officer. He clarified his identity, his rank, and his service record, emphasizing that he had faced far greater challenges than a roadside encounter. His words were deliberate, precise, and carried the quiet authority that comes from decades of leadership. He did not shout, he did not gesture wildly, but his presence alone commanded attention. The officer's fingers twitched on the trigger, his mind racing between suspicion, fear, and the confusion of facing someone who exuded control and authority. He had never been confronted with such a calm, composed response to aggression, and it unsettled him more than the general could have anticipated. The general maintained eye contact, unflinching, steady, conveying that he was aware of the officer's actions and intentions, yet he remained unthreatened. Time stretched on, the tension almost unbearable. Yet the general's calmness never faltered. He knew that the key to surviving this encounter was not to react with anger or fear, but to project unwavering composure and authority. He explained that any escalation could lead to serious consequences, not just legally, but personally for both of them. His voice was firm, confident, and devoid of any hint of panic. The general could see a shift in the officer, subtle but noticeable. The aggressive stance softened slightly, the gun wobbling almost imperceptibly. He continued speaking, calmly outlining that he had dedicated his life to protecting people, and that pulling a gun on him without reason was dangerous and unnecessary. Every word was measured, every gesture controlled.
And yet there was a quiet intensity in his tone that demanded attention and respect. Finally, a few more drivers slowed down,
their phones raised, capturing the moment. The general's mind raced through possible next steps, aware that witnesses could both help and complicate the situation. He remained composed, speaking in a steady rhythm, ensuring that his tone conveyed cooperation without submission. He emphasized that he was willing to follow the law, but that he deserved to be treated with respect and recognition. The officer's eyes flicked again to the medals, then to the general's face, and back again. Something in that moment started to shift. Perhaps it was the general's unshakable calm. Perhaps it was the visible authority and years of earned respect that radiated from him. Whatever it was, the officer hesitated, the tension momentarily broken, though the gun remained raised. The general continued to speak, calmly, steadily, reassuringly, yet firmly. The air seemed to thrum with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness of the street. The general kept his hands visible, his body language controlled, his voice unwavering. He knew that any sudden action could change everything, so he maintained complete composure, silently reminding the officer that he was dealing with someone who had been trained to handle crises calmly and decisively. Minutes passed like hours, and the officer's stance wavered. The general spoke one last time before a breakthrough, reminding him politely but firmly that life and careers could be ruined in an instant if mistakes were made, and that threats were not necessary. His words were calm, authoritative, and composed, yet they carried the weight of decades of experience and service. Finally, the officer's hand trembled visibly, and he blinked as if realizing the reality of the situation. The general's calmness, his control, and the undeniable presence of authority began to pierce through the haze of prejudice and aggression. The first cracks in the officer's composure appeared, and the moment of reckoning approached. The general remained calm, prepared for whatever came next, but confident that patience and discipline would guide the outcome. Through all of this, the general never lost sight of his goal: to de-escalate without humiliation, to assert his dignity without aggression, and to ensure that no one, including the officer Seymour, made a mistake that could have lasting consequences. His calm, measured approach served as both shield and lesson, demonstrating the power of discipline, respect, and human decency even in the face of irrational fear and bias. The tension hung thick in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on the street. The general kept his hands clearly on the steering wheel, every muscle in his body relaxed but ready to respond if needed. He could feel the eyes of the officer on him, sharp and suspicious, yet there was still no recognition of who he really was. The officer's hand was tight around the gun, his knuckles white, and every word from the general seemed only to irritate him more. The general spoke again, calmly explaining that he had no intention of resisting or causing trouble. He detailed his journey that day, the ceremony he had attended, and the work he had done for the military over decades. His voice was steady, carrying authority without aggression. He hoped reason would reach the officer, though he knew it might take longer than expected. His experience in tense situations had taught him patience. Sometimes it was better to let words and presence work quietly, like a steady current beneath stormy waters. The officer, however, was not calm. His eyes darted around, scanning the street, checking for witnesses or backup. The general noticed the subtle shifts in his posture, the foot tapping nervously, the slight wobble of the gun, and he realized that fear and uncertainty were beginning to creep into the officer's mind. Still, the officer was blinded by bias, unable to see beyond the color of the general's skin and the initial assumption that he was a threat. Around them, life carried on, but with unusual awareness. A few drivers slowed to a stop, rubbernecking as if drawn by a magnet. Some fumbled for their phones, quietly recording the encounter. Pedestrians paused on sidewalks, sensing that something was unusual, yet uncertain if they should intervene. The general knew that every movement mattered. He could not allow the situation to escalate, not just for his own safety, but for everyone present. He kept his words soft but deliberate, speaking with clarity that demanded attention. He reminded the officer that he was trained to handle crises and that he had faced situations far more dangerous than a roadside traffic stop. Yet he did not boast. He simply stated facts, letting his presence and experience convey authority. His calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's growing agitation. The officer's breathing became uneven. He barked questions that did not need answers and repeated commands for the general to step out of the car. The general answered each question with patience, repeating himself when necessary, never raising his voice. He explained once more that he was not a threat, that his hands were visible, and that he was fully willing to comply with any lawful request. Yet the officer's suspicion did not waver. The general's mind raced quietly, thinking of the best way to de-escalate without humiliation. He considered every angle, the officer's mindset, the public watching, the risks of sudden movement. He knew that rushing or showing impatience could be fatal. Instead, he focused on consistency and calm, letting his demeanor act as a buffer against the rising tension. Every word, every gesture was controlled, intentional, designed to reduce fear and assert dignity. The officer suddenly gestured sharply, pointing the gun toward the car door and demanding the general exit immediately. The general's response was measured. He asked politely yet firmly if they could first speak calmly and assess the situation. He reminded the officer that pulling a gun on a person in uniform without clear cause could have serious consequences. The words were deliberate, chosen to introduce reason and reflection without provoking further aggression. The general could feel the officer's inner conflict beginning to show. One moment he was fully committed to aggression, and the next a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The general maintained eye contact, steady and unwavering, allowing the officer to see that he was confident, in control, and not intimidated. It was a subtle but powerful shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to begin breaking the officer's initial assumptions. In the background, bystanders began whispering among themselves. Some continued recording, others called friends quietly to recount the unusual scene. The general remained aware of them but did not allow their presence to distract him. He understood the power of public observation in influencing behavior, but he also knew it could complicate things if he reacted hastily. He stayed focused on the officer, every word and movement calculated to maintain control of the situation. Minutes passed. The officer's hand on the gun began to shake slightly. He gave short, clipped orders that no longer carried the same conviction. The general continued speaking calmly, emphasizing respect and safety, highlighting that cooperation and understanding could prevent tragedy. He did not accuse or provoke. Instead, he used his voice to guide the officer toward reflection and restraint. The general's voice carried stories of experience without revealing personal details. He spoke of moments in his service where patience and composure had saved lives, and how a calm approach often prevented unnecessary conflict. The officer seemed to listen, though his fear was still evident. Slowly, his body language softened, the tightness in his posture loosening just a little, the gun no longer trembling as violently. Outside the car, a few drivers stepped out cautiously, keeping distance but watching intently. The general noticed them but did not react to their presence. He focused entirely on the officer, keeping the tone calm, deliberate, and commanding without threat. Each sentence was a gentle nudge toward clarity and understanding, reminding the officer of the gravity of his actions without harshness or anger. The officer's voice quavered slightly as he demanded to see the general's identification again. The general complied, slowly reaching for his wallet, keeping his hands visible at all times. He presented his ID and military credentials clearly, letting the officer examine them fully. The officer's eyes flicked over the documents, but still there was no immediate recognition, only confusion and lingering suspicion. The general stayed silent, allowing the officer the space to process. The general sensed a critical moment approaching. He spoke softly but firmly, explaining that mistakes in judgment could have severe consequences, emphasizing accountability and responsibility. He reminded the officer that respect and caution were essential, especially when dealing with people who served their country. His words were not accusatory but instructive, meant to guide rather than confront. The officer shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly struggling with the reality of the situation. His gun was still raised, but the confidence behind it had faded. The general's calm authority, his visible competence, and the undeniable truth of his words had begun to chip away at the officer's initial arrogance. The tension remained, but a subtle change had occurred. Fear, uncertainty, and a dawning realization were starting to influence the officer's actions. In that moment, the general thought about the countless times he had faced prejudice, bias, and assumptions based on appearance. He understood the importance of maintaining dignity and composure, even when confronted with irrational behavior. He stayed patient, letting his experience guide him, trusting that calm and steady action would lead to the best outcome. The officer took a hesitant step back, the gun lowering slightly, though not completely. The general maintained eye contact, reinforcing his calm presence. He reminded the officer again that he was willing to cooperate fully, but that threats and aggression were unnecessary. His tone was steady, his words precise, and the authority in his voice undeniable. Around them, the street seemed quieter, the whispers of onlookers hushed by the gravity of the scene. The general continued to speak, weaving in subtle lessons about respect, patience, and professionalism. His experience and calm were like an anchor in a stormy sea, gradually influencing the officer, guiding him away from reckless behavior. Time seemed suspended. Every movement, every breath, every word carried weight. The officer's posture softened more, the grip on the gun loosening as he began to realize the reality of the situation. The general spoke again, emphasizing that accountability, respect, and restraint were not signs of weakness but of strength and character. He did not lecture or intimidate. He simply embodied those principles. Finally, the officer's hand lowered further. The general kept speaking calmly, reinforcing the importance of understanding and measured action. He reminded the officer that anyone could make mistakes, but how one responded to them defined their integrity and character. The officer's voice grew quieter, less confident, and the tension began to dissipate slightly. The general remained alert, fully aware that the situation was not completely resolved, but the momentum had shifted. He had used patience, calm, and authority to de-escalate an intense encounter, without violence or humiliation. He had shown that even in the face of fear and prejudice, dignity, composure, and experience could prevail, turning a dangerous situation into a moment of reflection and potential understanding. As the officer finally lowered his gun fully, the general continued to speak softly, guiding him through the steps needed to conclude the encounter safely. The bystanders remained quietly observant, witnessing an extraordinary display of calm, authority, and human decency in the midst of a tense and potentially dangerous situation. The general's approach had begun to transform fear into awareness, aggression into reflection, and chaos into order, setting the stage for the next moments of reckoning. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he glanced at the general's ID once more. This time he read slowly, taking in every detail. His eyes widened as he realized that the man he had been threatening was not just any military officer, but a high-ranking army general with decades of experience and a decorated record of service. For a moment he could not believe what he was seeing. The realization hit him like a shockwave, and for the first time his confidence wavered completely. The general kept his hands raised slightly, showing no threat, his voice calm and steady. He observed the officer's change in demeanor with quiet awareness. Years of service had trained him to notice even the smallest shifts in body language, and he knew instinctively that the officer was now beginning to understand the seriousness of what he had done. Yet there was still tension in the air. The officer's initial prejudice had not vanished, but the weight of reality was beginning to take hold. The officer's breathing grew uneven, his eyes darting between the ID, the medals on the general's uniform, and the general himself. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible, as if questioning how he had not recognized the man before. The general spoke calmly, pointing out the importance of responsibility and the dangers of assumptions. He did not raise his voice or scold the officer, but each word carried authority and the quiet power of someone used to command. The general's words were simple but firm. He explained that pulling a gun on someone, especially a person in uniform who had served the country, was not only dangerous but could have serious legal and professional consequences. He emphasized accountability, using his calm demeanor to underscore the lesson without anger or humiliation. The officer's face flushed slightly, shame and fear mingling with disbelief. Outside, bystanders whispered and recorded the scene, sensing the dramatic shift. What had started as a tense standoff was now becoming a moment of reckoning. The general's composure was magnetic. It drew attention not through aggression, but through calm authority. The officer's aggression had dissipated, replaced by confusion and the dawning awareness of his mistake. The officer finally spoke, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. He asked questions that revealed his shock and his attempt to process the reality of who the general was. The general answered, still calm and composed, reinforcing the gravity of the situation without belittling the officer. He reminded him that respect and caution were not signs of weakness, but of discipline and understanding. For the first time, the officer lowered his weapon slightly, a visible sign of the shift in power. The general continued to speak, guiding the officer through the steps of acknowledging the mistake and acting responsibly. His words were deliberate, steady, and infused with the kind of authority that comes from experience rather than title alone. He maintained eye contact, showing both confidence and empathy, allowing the officer to recognize the error without complete humiliation. The officer's hands shook as he held the gun loosely now. The general's calmness seemed to create a ripple of control, easing the tension while reinforcing the lesson. The officer's eyes flicked to the medals, the uniform, and then back to the general's face. Each glance reinforced the realization that he had misjudged someone who had dedicated his life to service and leadership. The general spoke again, emphasizing patience, discipline, and responsibility. He reminded the officer that everyone makes mistakes, but how one responds to those mistakes defines their character. He did not raise his voice or make threats. He simply projected the steady confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations and emerged unshaken. The officer nodded slightly as if absorbing the weight of the lesson. As the officer began to process, the general continued to guide him calmly. He spoke of the importance of judgment, the consequences of rash decisions, and the respect owed to all people, regardless of assumptions. His voice carried the authority of experience, but also a human touch, reminding the officer that correction could be constructive rather than punitive. The tension continued to ease. The officer's posture softened further, his face reflecting a mixture of fear, regret, and dawning understanding. The general maintained composure, never letting the officer feel humiliated but ensuring that the seriousness of the situation was clear. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the idea that calm authority and integrity could turn a dangerous encounter into a moment of learning. Witnesses on the street watched in awe as the standoff evolved. The general's demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's initial aggression. Instead of chaos and fear, there was now reflection and awareness. The officer lowered the weapon completely, shaking slightly, and the general nodded subtly, acknowledging the first steps toward de-escalation. The general spoke softly but firmly, offering guidance on how the officer should proceed. He emphasized accountability, encouraging the officer to report the incident properly and to reflect on his actions. His tone was steady, devoid of anger, but imbued with the authority of someone who had lived through many high-pressure situations and knew the value of measured responses. The officer, still trembling, nodded. He realized the gravity of his mistake and began to understand the consequences of acting on prejudice rather than reason. The general continued to speak calmly, highlighting that courage and discipline were not about dominance or intimidation, but about restraint and moral clarity. His words were simple yet powerful, a reflection of a life spent leading with integrity. Time seemed to slow as the officer absorbed the reality of the situation. He glanced at the general's uniform, the medals, the steady gaze, and the calm presence that radiated experience and authority. The realization that he had threatened someone of such distinction was humbling and shocking. He swallowed hard, the weight of guilt pressing on him. But the general's composure softened the moment, turning it into an opportunity for learning rather than confrontation. The general spoke one last time before the situation began to resolve. He emphasized that respect and caution were essential, that assumptions could be dangerous, and that every action carried responsibility. His voice was steady, deliberate, and calm, providing both guidance and a model of dignity under pressure. The officer listened intently, realizing that this encounter had become more than a simple traffic stop. It was a lesson in humility and human decency. Finally, the officer lowered his weapon fully and took a step back. The general kept his hands visible, maintaining a composed presence while reinforcing the importance of respect and accountability. The bystanders remained quietly observant, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The general's calm authority and the officer's dawning understanding had turned a tense, dangerous situation into a profound lesson on human behavior and morality. The general remained alert, aware that the situation was not yet over, but confident that the most dangerous moment had passed. He continued to speak softly, guiding the officer through proper procedures and emphasizing the importance of learning from mistakes. The officer's posture and expression reflected a mixture of relief, respect, and reflection. He had been confronted with the reality of his actions and the presence of someone who embodied discipline, composure, and moral authority. The general's approach had worked. He had de-escalated the threat, taught a valuable lesson, and maintained his dignity and safety. The officer now faced the challenge of reconciling his initial prejudice with the reality of who he had threatened. The general's calm, controlled presence had created space for reflection, accountability, and growth, demonstrating the power of patience and authority in even the most dangerous encounters. As the scene continued to unfold, the general remained composed, guiding the officer with quiet authority and empathy. His words emphasized the importance of responsibility, the dangers of assumptions, and the value of human decency. The officer listened, his previous aggression replaced by understanding and respect. Witnesses on the street felt the gravity of the encounter, recognizing the extraordinary nature of what they were observing. Through it all, the general never lost control. His calmness, experience, and integrity transformed a potentially violent confrontation into a moment of learning and reflection. The officer, now visibly humbled, began to understand the significance of his actions and the authority of the man before him. The scene had shifted completely, from aggression and prejudice to reflection, accountability, and respect, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. The officer lowered the gun completely, his hands shaking as the reality of the situation settled in. He looked at the general, eyes wide, as though seeing him for the first time. The general stayed calm, his posture straight, his hands clearly visible, radiating authority and experience without aggression. It was a stark contrast to the officer who now looked small, unsettled, and unsure. The general's calmness seemed to fill the space around them, creating a sense of control that the officer could not resist. The general spoke softly but firmly, emphasizing that this was not a moment for humiliation but for reflection. He explained the seriousness of the officer's actions, pointing out that pulling a gun on someone without reason could have severe consequences. His tone was steady, calm, and measured, making it clear that he was in full control, yet without creating fear or panic. The officer listened, still trembling as the weight of the lesson sank in. "Respect and caution are not signs of weakness," the general said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership and experience. "They are signs of discipline and strength. You must always remember the responsibility that comes with the authority you hold." The officer nodded slowly, words failing him as he tried to process the truth in the general's statements. He could feel his mistake pressing on him, the gravity of what he had done making him realize how dangerously close he had come to disaster. The general continued, reminding the officer that everyone makes mistakes, but how one responds to those mistakes defines their character. His calmness was like a shield, softening the officer's fear while highlighting the seriousness of his error. He spoke of accountability, integrity, and respect, framing the conversation in a way that allowed the officer to learn without feeling humiliated. Every word was intentional, chosen to guide rather than condemn. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of surrendering to the lesson being taught. He glanced at the medals on the general's chest and finally saw them not as decorations, but as symbols of a life spent serving with honor and courage. For a long moment he was silent, absorbing the weight of what he had almost destroyed. The general maintained his composure, not rushing, giving the officer the space to reflect on the gravity of his actions. Bystanders had gathered at a safe distance, their phones raised quietly to record the extraordinary event. They whispered among themselves, sensing that they were witnessing something remarkable. The general, aware of their presence, did not react to it. He focused entirely on the officer, ensuring that the lesson was clear and that the situation would end without further conflict. His calmness and authority were like a guiding light, steering the encounter away from potential disaster. The officer finally spoke, his voice small, almost inaudible. He admitted that he had acted too quickly, letting prejudice and assumption cloud his judgment. The general nodded, acknowledging the admission without judgment or anger. He emphasized that recognition of error is the first step toward growth and responsibility. The officer listened, feeling both shame and relief, realizing that the general's calmness had prevented a tragedy and taught him a lesson he would not forget. The general spoke about the importance of empathy and understanding. He explained that authority carries with it the responsibility to act with caution, respect, and fairness. He reminded the officer that fear and assumption should never dictate actions, especially when the lives of others could be affected. His words were clear, simple, and direct, yet they carried a profound depth of experience and moral clarity. The officer's hand finally stopped trembling as he lowered his gaze, shame and understanding battling within him. He realized that his actions had been reckless, that he had almost endangered a life without cause. The general, noticing the change, continued to speak calmly, reinforcing the lesson of restraint and reflection. He did not scold or humiliate the officer. Instead, he allowed the officer to reach the realization on his own, guiding him gently but firmly. The general then addressed the importance of accountability, explaining that mistakes must be acknowledged and rectified. He encouraged the officer to report the incident properly and reflect on his behavior, stressing that learning from errors is what strengthens character. His voice remained calm and steady, a stark contrast to the officer's earlier aggression, making it clear who held authority not through intimidation, but through composure and experience. The officer nodded again, a mix of relief and respect in his eyes. He understood now that the general's calmness and patience had prevented a catastrophe and had turned a dangerous situation into a teaching moment. The general's demeanor had created an environment where learning and reflection could occur without fear or humiliation. It was a rare combination of firmness, understanding, and moral authority that left a lasting impression. The general spoke about the dangers of prejudice and assumptions, reminding the officer that bias can cloud judgment and lead to disastrous consequences. He emphasized that every person deserves respect, and that assumptions based on appearance or preconception are never justified. His words were not confrontational but instructive, aimed at opening the officer's mind to a broader understanding of human behavior and responsibility. The officer listened intently, finally understanding the depth of the lesson. He realized that the general's calm authority had not only saved the encounter from escalating but had also offered him a rare opportunity to reflect on his own biases and actions. The general's presence had transformed a moment of fear and aggression into one of learning and growth. The bystanders continued to watch, their whispers quiet, sensing the shift in power and understanding. The general's ability to maintain composure in the face of danger was awe-inspiring. His patience, calmness, and moral authority had disarmed the situation without violence, teaching a profound lesson about human dignity and responsibility. The officer's posture, once aggressive and tense, now reflected humility and awareness, a testament to the general's skill in handling the encounter. The general then guided the officer through the next steps. He advised him to lower his weapon completely, to step back, and to ensure that the situation was documented properly. His instructions were simple, clear, and firm, emphasizing the importance of accountability and procedure. The officer followed each instruction, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful compliance and respect. Throughout the encounter, the general remained calm and composed, a model of restraint and authority. He never raised his voice or threatened, yet his presence commanded respect. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, responded with deference and attentiveness. It was a profound shift, a moment of humility that transformed both the officer's understanding and the dynamic of the situation. The general concluded by reminding the officer of the lessons to be learned. Patience, restraint, accountability, and respect are the foundations of true authority. His words were simple but carried the weight of experience and moral clarity. The officer listened, absorbing the wisdom and understanding that this encounter would be a turning point in his professional life. He had faced someone who embodied discipline, composure, and integrity, and it had left a lasting impact. Finally, the general acknowledged the officer's willingness to learn and reflect, reinforcing the positive steps taken to resolve the situation. The officer lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect and understanding. The general's calmness, patience, and guidance had transformed a potentially violent encounter into a lesson in humility, human decency, and moral responsibility. The bystanders, witnesses to the extraordinary moment, left with a sense of awe, understanding the power of calm authority and ethical leadership. The officer stood frozen for a few moments, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on him. He had almost made a terrible mistake, one that could have ended in tragedy, and it was only the general's calm presence and authority that had prevented disaster. He lowered his gaze, ashamed, but also aware of the lesson he had just learned in the most direct and humbling way possible. The general, still calm and composed, kept his hands visible, maintaining the quiet authority that had guided the encounter from start to finish. The general spoke softly, ensuring that the officer fully understood the importance of what had just occurred. He emphasized that the real danger lay not in the officer's weapon, but in the assumptions and biases that had fueled his actions. These invisible threats, the general explained, could be far more destructive than any physical weapon. He highlighted that respect, discipline, and awareness were the true shields against mistakes that could harm lives. Outside the car, bystanders who had witnessed the entire exchange began to murmur quietly among themselves. Some had recorded parts of the incident. Others simply watched in awe at the extraordinary display of patience, calmness, and moral authority. The general noticed the attention but remained focused solely on the officer. His calm, steady voice continued, explaining that authority without accountability could lead to disastrous consequences and that every person, regardless of rank or background, deserved fair treatment. The officer, still visibly shaken, tried to respond but found words difficult. He finally muttered an apology, not just for his actions but for the assumptions and prejudice that had clouded his judgment. The general nodded slightly, acknowledging the sincerity in the officer's voice. He explained that recognition of error was the first step toward improvement, and that every mistake offered a chance to grow, provided one learned from it. The general guided the officer through the next steps with calm precision. He instructed him to lower his weapon completely, to step back from the vehicle, and to follow the proper procedures for documenting the incident. Each instruction was clear and deliberate, designed to restore safety and order while reinforcing accountability. The officer complied, his earlier confidence replaced by humility and attentiveness. As the situation stabilized, the general reflected briefly on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had faced prejudice and danger throughout his career, but this encounter was different. It was not on a battlefield or in a training exercise. It was on a quiet suburban street where the stakes were just as high in their own way. The ability to remain calm, patient, and authoritative in such a situation was a testament to his training, experience, and inner discipline. The officer's demeanor began to change noticeably. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and the tension that had gripped him from the start began to dissipate. He realized that the general's calmness had not been passive. It had been deliberate, a strategic and moral approach that diffused the situation without violence. He had been confronted with someone who embodied leadership, patience, and integrity, and the contrast with his own rushed, prejudiced actions was striking. The general continued to speak, this time emphasizing the broader lesson. He explained that every person in a position of authority has a responsibility, not just to enforce rules, but to understand, respect, and protect those they encounter. He highlighted that decisions made in haste, fueled by assumptions, could have far-reaching consequences. His voice was calm, measured, and filled with a quiet authority that left a lasting impression on the officer. The bystanders remained quietly observant, sensing the gravity of the moment. The general's ability to control the situation without aggression, to teach without belittling, and to guide without threats was remarkable. It was a rare combination of moral authority, practical experience, and human empathy that transformed a potentially dangerous encounter into a profound lesson. The officer seemed to absorb this, his posture and expression reflecting both shame and respect. The general spoke about courage, not as the ability to dominate or intimidate, but as the capacity to act with patience, discipline, and moral clarity under pressure. He reminded the officer that true authority comes from understanding, respect, and the ability to manage both oneself and the situation calmly. His words resonated deeply, illustrating the difference between power wielded recklessly and leadership exercised responsibly. The officer finally looked up fully, meeting the general's gaze with a mixture of realization and respect. He acknowledged silently and then verbally the lessons he had just learned. The general nodded, allowing the moment of understanding to settle. There was no triumph or condescension in the general's demeanor, only a steady presence and moral clarity that reinforced the gravity of the lesson. The general guided the officer to complete the necessary steps to ensure that the encounter was properly recorded and that accountability was maintained. Each step was carried out calmly, with the officer following the instructions carefully, now fully aware of the consequences that could have arisen from his initial actions. The process, though routine, became a teaching moment, reinforcing the lessons of restraint, responsibility, and respect. As the situation drew to a close, the officer lowered his head slightly, a gesture of both humility and respect. He had faced the reality of his mistake and recognized the importance of correction and reflection. The general's calm, authoritative presence had turned a potentially disastrous encounter into a moment of learning, growth, and human connection. Witnesses on the street were left with a sense of awe at the display of discipline, composure, and moral authority. The general finally leaned back slightly in his seat, signaling that the encounter was effectively resolved. He spoke one last time, emphasizing the importance of learning from this experience, of maintaining respect and caution, and of acknowledging the power and responsibility inherent in positions of authority. His words were simple, clear, and profound, leaving an enduring impact on the officer and all who had witnessed the event. The officer took a deep breath, finally able to relax, his hands no longer trembling. He had been confronted with the stark reality of his prejudice and rash actions, and he had been guided toward understanding and accountability. The general's calm authority and moral clarity had not only prevented disaster, but had transformed the officer's perspective on responsibility and human dignity. The general started the car, preparing to leave, but not without one final reminder. He spoke quietly, emphasizing the importance of reflection, integrity, and the responsible exercise of authority. The officer nodded, understanding that this encounter would remain with him for the rest of his career, a constant reminder of the dangers of assumption and the power of calm, disciplined leadership. As the general drove away, the bystanders watched in quiet admiration. The street returned to its normal rhythm, but the impact of what had occurred lingered. The general had turned a potentially violent, racially charged encounter into a moment of profound learning and reflection. His composure, authority, and moral clarity had not only saved lives but had offered a lesson that would resonate far beyond this quiet suburban street. The officer remained on the curb, reflecting deeply on his actions. He understood that he had almost crossed a line from which there would have been no return. He vowed silently to carry the lessons he had learned from the general forward in his life and career. The encounter had changed him, teaching him the value of patience, respect, accountability, and moral strength. The general continued his drive home, quietly reflecting on the day. He knew that his calm, disciplined approach had prevented tragedy and had created an opportunity for growth and learning. It was a reminder that even in everyday life, discipline, patience, and moral authority could transform dangerous situations into moments of understanding, reflection, and human connection. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that integrity and composure had once again made a difference in the world.